Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all were able to grab some snacks. There's plenty, so feel free to get more if you're still hungry. Welcome. We haven't had a Ronning Center event yet this year, so a belated Happy New Year from the Ronning Center. Today we have with us Dr. Jim Linville from the University of Lethbridge. Jim was born and grew up right here in Alberta and attended the University of Alberta, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies. He then went on to do a PhD in Scotland at the University of Edinburgh before returning to Alberta to complete a postdoc at the university, and then a professorship at the University of Lethbridge, which is where he continues to work today. Jim is an expert in the Hebrew Bible, and especially in prophetic literature, which is how I met Jim and how I've gotten to know him over the last number of years. But in recent years, he's actually switched his research focus somewhat from the cosmic imaginings of ancient Israelites and Judeans to our cosmic imaginings in the present day. A few years ago, he traded his ancient historian hat for an anthropology hat, so to speak, and began touring North America, visiting as many creation museums as possible, from the grand and well-funded to the small and tucked away, from California to Kentucky to right here in Alberta. In his work now, he's focusing on how different communities continually make and remake myth with the biblical texts, imagining and reimagining themselves and others in and through biblical literature. And when I use that term myth, and when Dr. Linville uses that term myth, we don't mean it as a kind of bad word, so to speak. We're all continually making myths in different sorts of ways in our different contexts. And today he's going to share with us some of that work, including some photos from the various sites he's visited, which I'm looking forward to, and also about what he's learned about how people curate creationism in North America today. I should also say, I don't know if some of you have been watching or following these news stories in the States, but just recently in the fall, the Museum of the Bible opened in Washington, D.C., a private institution funded by the Green family, who owns the Hobby Lobby chain of craft stores in the United States. Jim was also involved just recently at the annual meeting of the Association for Jewish Studies in a international panel of respondents who talked about that museum as well. So I don't know if you're going to touch on that at all today, but in the discussion time, if you've been following the opening of the Museum of the Bible in DC and have questions about that, he has been and has seen and has thought about it in some detail. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Linville.
Well, first of all, thanks to Ian for the invite and Diane for all the organization, and to all of you for coming out. Ian was just about as astute as I was going to get, so we might as well go for coffee. Anyway, I've been down at the U of L for about 15 years, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it, but nowadays I'm going out having a look at all of these creationist stuff, and don't have to go too far, but it sure helps if you do. Now, in talking about these places and the ideology and beliefs behind it all, I should add that I'm not here to mock them or anything like that, or to defend them, but merely to understand how and why they're doing what they are, in fact, doing. So there's an awful lot of them around, and I'll give you kind of a really quick tour of that, and in the process try to highlight why people are investing this kind of money, time, and so on and so forth, and what it's really, what I think it's really doing for the communities of Christians who do subscribe to creationist beliefs and really don't like the theory of evolution. Now, when we were planning this out on the telephone with Ian a few weeks ago, he told me not to mention this guy, Michel Foucault. He's never been to a creation museum, so he's kind of irrelevant. But he's a French philosopher, that kind of thing, likes turtlenecks. I don't know if he's ever been out here. Who knows? Anyway, as far as the creation museums go, this is the one sort of physical presence creationism has for itself here in North America. There's two primary ones that lots of people know about because of the publicity. And that's the Answers in Genesis Creation Museum. They were really inventive with the title. Opened in 2007, and in 2016 they opened the Ark Encounter. Both of these are in northern Kentucky. Some of you might have to stand up or yell down in front once in a while. That's okay. Just don't. We were talking. Just don't throw the tomatoes at me.
You can throw them at me.
He said. Now the Creation Museum opened in 2007. It's 75,000 square feet, sitting on 49 acres in northern Kentucky, just by the Ohio River, southwest of Cincinnati. The Ark Encounter is about 45 miles south at a place called Williamstown, Kentucky, a small little town, and they leveled the top of a hill to put it there. And it's 120,000 square foot. It's the largest wood frame building on the planet. A lot of the labor came from Amish craftsmen who volunteered their efforts. And there was tax breaks and everything, but the whole thing, they're planning a whole theme park, and this is running about $100 and some million bucks. Now, this isn't the oldest creation museum, but it is, except for this, it is the biggest and it's the most famous. Bill Nye, the science guy, debated the founder of Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham, here in 2014. And this 2-hour-long debate, you can find it for free up on YouTube, or you can give Answers in Genesis some money for a high-resolution copy. They'll also sell you a book explaining why Ken Ham won. Anyway, it got global publicity. So when people talk about the Creation Museum, this tends to be the one they're talking about. And then there's the Ark. However, there's about 3 dozen creation museums in the world. Most are in the United States. But per capita, Canada has more than the Americans. Doesn't that make you feel good? So for some of you, yes. And I'll leave it up to you whether or not that was sarcastic. Alberta has 2.5, depending how you count it. And I'll show you some slides from there. There's a couple in Ontario, one in Winnipeg. But you can see scattered all around here, and there's places now building and planning to build, and that's why we get the title of my talk being Fruitful and Multiplying, and they're just building more and more in various places. I wonder, pun intended, when the market will be flooded. Sorry. Look, when you're professing, you don't get a budget for a joke writer, so you're just going to have to deal with it. Now, this creationism business, I should clarify a few things about that, because there's different flavors of it. The one we'll be talking about most is so-called Young Earth Creationists. And this school of thought teaches that the Earth and the whole universe is, in fact, well, as it says on the tin, quite young. The usual date is, or age is about 6,000 years old, and some would push this to about 10,000 years and incur the wrath of the 6,000-year crowd. In the 17th century, Archbishop James Ussher calculated from biblical chronologies and genealogies that the world was created on the 23rd of October, 4004 BCE. And this tends to be the number that the Young Earth crowd generally accepts. And so everything is dated after that. The flood of Noah happened around 2348 BCE, give or take a year or two. And all sorts of things sort of develop from there. They advocate a very, very strict narrative based on Genesis chapters 1 to 3. So the creation week of 6 24 hours, phases of creation followed by 1 day of divine rest, a historical Adam and Eve as the original human beings, and with that a historical talking snake, expulsion from paradise, introduction of death, as in before this fall, no death, no suffering, no poisons, no predation, and vegetarian tyrannosauruses. In fact, all significant Christian doctrine is said to come or be based in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And it is not a cheap literalism. For their understanding of Christian salvation to work, the Bible must be true. And for the Gospel's good news, there must be Genesis bad news. The doctrine of original sin must be historical. When God created everything on the 6th day, He looked at it all and said, "It is all very good." If there were millions of years of things living, suffering, and dying, how could God say, "This is good," at the creation of humanity? So we have a very deep merging of a rethinking of observations from the earth and a deep spirituality based around the biblical texts. Now, the Young Earth crowd tends to be various evangelical Protestants, Baptists and so forth, and Seventh-day Adventists, although the two groups sometimes don't see eye to eye on any number of other doctrinal things. Some evangelical churches, their congregation might be split, and other churches will definitely affirm a Young Earth creationism or some alternative. And it has been the site of a lot of local infighting. And the Young Earth creationists and a number of these creation museums, especially the big ones, they're as hard, if not harder, on what they consider to be compromised Christians who accept an old earth, as they are on the evolution crowd. They're more mad at liberal Christians than they are at the evil atheist scientific conspiracy. And so that brings up the old earth creationists. Again, this is quite popular in evangelical circles, but they understand that the earth can be very, very old indeed. And so they will accept the geological timescales, that sort of thing. But they still see God's creation of humanity and probably the animals as a unique kind of divine act. a number of ways of making this work with the Bible. They'll ignore the genealogies, sometimes imagine each day in the creation week story actually refers to thousands of years or a geological age, something like that. Now, in the early part of this century, a number of evangelical scholars got together and wrote a multi-volume work called The Fundamentals that addressed the challenge of modernity and modern science to the evangelical faith. And this collection is where we get the word fundamentalist from. And it was a positive self-description of evangelicals arguing about the very fundamentals of what they understood their faith to be. Evolution and geology figure prominently in this collection. A number of the writers, there's 90 essays, a number of them tackled the science of the day. And very many of them were okay with the earth being very old. One guy named Orr wrote that we get a greater sense of the glory of God when we realize how old his creation actually is. So, for many evangelicals 100 years ago, there didn't need to be a very young earth. They were reading Genesis in a different sort of way. Afterwards, the Young Earth movement grew up and started challenging them because they held the Bible to be completely inerrant in all matters, including references to the natural world, all sorts of things like that. There's another... the Jehovah's Witnesses actually are the old earth creationists too, although they don't like the word creationist. The other group that we should refer to are what can be called theistic evolution. So basically, God did it, but he used evolution. So the world is very old, geological timescales are plausible. God did use evolution to produce the human body out of various ape-like ancestors, and we all started out as slugs somewhere in a primordial soup. But God is involved. There's an organization called BioLogos, which is an evangelical organization advocating theistic evolution as an opponent to, especially to the Young Earth crowd. The Catholic Church seems to accept this theistic evolution as well, saying it's perfectly okay to argue that the human body evolved. God was involved with the creation of the human soul. And a number of popes have affirmed various groups of that. And then there's the intelligent design crowd. These guys kind of want well, it's hard to put them in context. They often refuse to accept any kind of evolutionary thought, but they'll accept that the world could be quite old. And as it says, they're looking for a designer because they find that the world is too complicated to have happened by chance. Now, the thing is, they almost never try to define the designer. They want to advertise their point of view as the result of pure scientific thinking, nothing to do with theology. So they'll argue there was a designer. They won't try to define the designer in any kind of theological terms. So the Young Earth crowd and the ID crowd, they'll borrow a lot of arguments, but they're kind of at each other's throats about how upfront you should be on theological issues. So this is sort of the landscape, and it's the Young Earth crowd that build the museums. I don't know of any other museums from the other position. Some of these, the theistic evolution and some parts of intelligent design might be okay with normal natural history museums. The ID people, if the museum isn't going to talk too much about evolution, they'd be okay with it. But the Young Earth crowd they need this replacement for natural history museums. Museums carry a lot of cultural values, speaking about authority and so forth. You can't send your kids to the Royal Tyrrell and get them to learn the truth. But that little museum in Bow Island, that's a repository of truth. So it's kind of a defiance of regular science. And if you want, the Creation Science Association of Alberta does produce its own guide to the Royal Tyrrell. You can write to them, it was about $8. So this is what we're looking at, primarily the Young Earth crowd. Now, are they really museums? Some of them don't have anything old, right? They're nothing particularly old. They don't have scientists on staff, or the people they do have are amateurs, and so on and so forth. This is the Discovery Center in Abilene, Texas, that actually is a bit of a hodgepodge of all sorts of things relating to trying to prove young earth creationism, various things that local people have donated. It's curiosity sort of shop, that sort of thing. Very much an amateur thing, and it's been going for a few decades. They're recently expanding it. So it's hard to go in there and see any kind of museum. Nothing seems to be really curated there. It's really a hodgepodge in some ways. Loosely framed around this young earth creationist perspective. Others, however, are amazingly well done. This is the Glendive Dinosaur and Fossil Museum in Glendive, Montana. As you can see, they can't even fit the one dinosaur in the building. This is the second largest dinosaur museum in the state. They had some kind of money here. That you'll notice from the title of the place, it doesn't indicate that it's a creationist facility at all. But it's really well done. This is the inside of it. They have real fossils. They've got, it's all very, very well curated. There's a logical narrative that goes through it to convince you, or at least to reaffirm the believer's sense that a young earth teaching is correct. This is the Museum of Earth History in Dallas, Texas, on the campus of a Pentecostal Bible school. They again, beautifully done displays and everything, and this museum is also expanding from when I was there about 2 years ago when I took this picture with their nastysaurus. Lots of dinosaurs in these places. Let me see, what else have I got? This is the Creation Evidence Museum in Glenrose, Texas. There's currently 4 creation museums in Texas. There's the Abilene, one in Crosbyton, then the one that I just showed you, and this one. And here we have some interesting things. Again, it's got all sorts of different things in it, but focused towards this young earth creationism. But what's really intriguing is that it claims to be a research center as well. This is what the owner, Carl Baugh, calls his hyperbaric chamber, where he tries to recreate the Earth's climate before Noah's flood, and using it to explain how this pre-flood environment led to the Bible's claims of extraordinarily long lives. And so I don't know what kind, he's Dr. Baugh, but I don't know what his doctorate is in. It might be theology or something like that. But you get a number of this sort of thing happening at some of these museums. So they're sites of at least creation science, which is an answer to the ascendancy of science in the secular world. there wasn't anything in there when I went by a few years ago. Let's see. Now, a number of people have recently got their PhDs studying this, these creation museums. Many of them come from museum studies, history of science, that kind of thing. And what they're really interested in is how creation museums, and especially the big ones in Kentucky that I showed you, take sort of the genre of natural history museum. So they take all the trappings of a natural history museum and superimpose upon this their understanding of the Bible and their biblical view of the history of the earth. And they sort of make a double resolution photograph and tried various ways to harmonize all of this. And Lindsay Barone, who got her PhD a couple of years ago with a wonderful dissertation on how these museums serve to focus attention on a social movement and to create a social movement. How these museums bring together the world of science and the world of scripture and produce kind of a hybrid and so forth. And she uses the term heterotopia to refer to this place of otherness where two different worldviews come together in a separate place. And I should add that she borrowed this term from He Who Shall Not Be Named, our wonderful French philosopher, so I snuck it in there, but don't tell Ian. You'll be back. Okay. So a number of other people have also talked about how these places are kind of they're between one world and between another. It's not a purely biblical world, and it's certainly not a purely scientific world. But they're negotiating their way around all of these little things. And part of my research will be to look at how this fusion, or at least an attempt at fusion, produces new kinds of narratives. Some might object that this is inherently contradictory position, that they're always going to be running into problems. Scientific issues they can't resolve, theological issues that arise from one set of decisions, but that's the way everybody lives their lives. If you think you've got a perfectly consistent ideology, you're probably a nutcase. Right? There's always going to be things that jump out and say, what are we going to do about that? Oh man, didn't think about that. Right? And so we all tell new stories and variants of old stories and stuff, and this is kind of what I'm looking at. So we have, sorry some of these didn't show up too well, we have dinosaurs on Noah's Ark. This is from the Ark Encounter. We have vegetarian raptors in the Garden of Eden. Were unicorns on the Ark a very serious issue? And here we have from Answers in Genesis, peer-reviewed science journal, Dr. Danny R. Faulkner, who actually does have a degree in astrophysics, something in astrophysics from a real university, wondering about the second law of thermodynamics and how it relates to God's curse on the universe from Genesis. So all of this is trying to wiggle this out. And there's disagreements on all of this, and just like other scientists, they'll argue back and forth in their own authorized journals who might have the best model to explain creation using the language of science and so forth. So we have this, what seems on the outside to be a forced agreement, but within the creationist community, it's a creative tension. And this is what's interesting to me. It's how all of this generates new kinds of social thought and things like this. And Dr. Wilson can regale you with tales of J.Z. Smith's theories on that kind of thing. I won't. He wouldn't let me talk about Foucault, so. Now, through all of this, what we get is tremendous stress. Not so much on the science. That seems to be what's going on from an outsider going in there. But it's the gospel that is behind all of this. This is the Ark encounter, and this is a big door on the side. You don't enter through this door. That is there for symbolic purposes. When you get in there, this is on the second floor, you come in through the bottom and you work your way up. This door is a metaphor for Christ, who said in one of the Gospels, I am the door. If you're going to enter heaven, you go through me. And so they established this sort of metaphor. Which side of this door would you be on if the flood came today? Will you be on the ark or drowning with the rest of creation? And so it's these sort of stacking chairs of one biblical narrative on another, working its way through with a lot of scientific rhetoric to make it plausible to somebody living in this world. Rhetorically, this is an absolute masterpiece. You come in through the bottom, and I'll show you in a little bit. Oh, here we go. Rows of animal cages. They're so tightly thatched, if there's a little model animal in there, you can't see it because it's too dark. Nothing special about them except their number. This is really immersive stuff. Rows of bags of supposed critter kibble, right? You know, Purina dinosaur chow or whatever. More jars. And it goes on and on and on. And all the while you're walking through this, the lights are fairly low. There's a soundtrack playing of waves, wood creaking, and animals panicking. Right? You go, here's Noah and his family praying, and this is a great social commentary. Noah seems to be kind of Middle Eastern. This woman, I forget, they gave names to all of the characters. The women in the Noah's Ark story don't get names. But they've named all of these. She seems to be North American First Nations. She seems to be of African descent. Strong rhetoric here trying to undo the racism that has been prevalent in the United States by saying all humans stem from one pair of ancestors. So on the ark, representatives of the whole world have to be there. But you get this praying for safety on this fake boat. And as you go up, it gets brighter, quieter, more spacious, until you get to the top floor. I don't think I have a photo here. The crew quarters are absolutely lovely. This is heaven. Safety from outside. Rhetorically, it's brilliant. This is the first creation museum in Santee, California. It was started in the 80s on a different site, but moved to Santee in 1992. This is real close to San Diego. You can get to it on the San Diego transport. And just down the street, there's a brewery. I recommend it. And a great big dinosaur, T-Rex, that's not very convincing. But the lady at the brewery said they get a lot of people stopping in asking about it. Anyway, the brewery is highly recommended. So this has been going on. This is the first one. Now this tabernacle theater, it was an addition made somewhat later. It's a narration of the biblical tabernacle in the wilderness wanderings. How the Israelites were told to build this tent shrine, install the Ark of the Covenant and the priesthoods, and offer sacrifices to God. So in this ideology, that prefigures the sacrifice of Christ. So they built on the stage kind of the interior of the tabernacle, with an altar and the Ark of the Covenant model, a few mannequins for high priests, and there's an audiovisual audio narration of it with spotlights and so forth. And as I was telling Ian, when you go in there, just so you don't miss the connection that they talk about throughout the entire 30-minute show, when you go in there, there's a bin full of stuffed lambs that you're supposed to take, to hold, to represent you. They don't give you a plastic knife to disembowel the thing. You have to put it back after. But this is the Lamb of God. And as I was saying, there was a couple there. When I went, they didn't take the lamb. So if they're going to go around saying they're saved, we know better. But this facility highlights all the kinds of arguments that show up in creationist discussion. Evolution is a false science. Young Earth Creationism explains all fossil evidence, all astrophysics, so on and so forth. There is nothing in the Bible, there is nothing in science that denies anything in the Bible. The Bible is accurate in all of its statements. Humanity is damned, and Christ is needed to save our souls. Also, evolutionary thinking becomes the sin of the garden. Evolutionary thinking is putting your mind ahead of God's, of looking at constant change instead of moral absolutes. And the consequences of evolutionary thinking, I don't know how well you can see this, abortion, the Nazi Holocaust, war, racism, all of this. And the founder of this museum, Henry Morris, has written books, very, very many books, discussing how all other religions other than Young Earth Creationist Christianity are somehow marked by evolutionary thought. So this becomes, in this sort of story or sacred story or myth of the universe, evolution is the big bogeyman. This is what is being, the devil is being, or is disseminating around the world. And it's been this way since time immemorial. So the believer is there with Adam and Eve, having to make a choice. Do you go with God or do you go with human mind? And if you go to almost any of these other museums, this sort of question is there. They're conversion narratives, is what they are. They're preaching to the converted and hopefully to the curious and anybody else. Now, the outfit that started this museum, the Institute for Creation Research, sold it a few years ago, and they're building a new one in Dallas, Texas, some 30,000 square foot, so smaller than the Answers in Genesis one. Now, I mentioned Ham's Ark. It's actually a big building, okay? It's not a boat. It's anchored to a Kentucky hilltop with a bunch of great big concrete piers and so on and so forth. Wait, oops, I think this one floats. Johan Huybers from Holland put together a full-size Noah's Ark on a series of connected barges, and he drags it around from port to port, preaching the gospel. It broke loose, I think, was it Stockholm or something, and collided with a bunch of other ships. But if you read the Bible, the Ark did not have its own motor, you know, so that's perfectly accurate. This is the second Ark he's actually built. He built a half-scale one, but he sold it to some other guy who's using it for similar purposes. We'll go back. This is the Northwest Science Museum, projected to be built at some point in Boise, Idaho. They have a small center already operating in Boise to help it gain funds. They want $150 million for this. Their plan is 350,000 square feet. That is 3 times the size of the Royal Tyrrell. This might be a pipe dream. As I said, the market might be a little bit flooded. But they've already opened things and they're busy getting donors. Now, there's other Ark projects. There's actually one in Switzerland. So I can find very little information about it. People are trying to raise funds for a giant Noah's Ark theme park in Switzerland. England has a few small creation museums, and there's a couple in Germany. In Canada, a couple years ago, there was a news report that Chinese businessmen wanted to build a Noah's Ark in Moose Jaw, right by the sea. I haven't, after a spate of news reports, nothing seems to have come of it yet, but there was apparently approvals from the Moose Jaw Town Council. It's right by the cemetery, so. Now, recently, the Ontario government turned down the plan by Mr. Ed Van Gennep, who's a software developer, to build this museum of nature, science, something or other. It's changed names a few times. It's in the early fundraising stage. But again, he wants a full-sized Noah's Ark. He wanted to build it in Ontario Place, which is prime real estate in Toronto. And so the provincial government turned him down on that, so he's looking for another spot and for money. Again, he wants $100 million. But this great extravaganza will have a 60-seat Ark simulator. And this is a picture I stole from his online thing. So you can imagine 60 people, 30 there, 30 here, with a simulator being thrown around as if they're in the worst storm humanly imaginable. Who wants to ride on a seasickness simulator? How much do you think, I don't know what the minimum wage is, but I won't want a job cleaning up after each performance. Let me just say that. So anyway, is this another pipe dream? 100 million in Canada for that? Probably. But it seems as if the success Answers in Genesis has had is forcing more and more, or is leading more and more people to think this is a great idea. Now, there's a lot of smaller museums, and many of them are actually no bigger than this room, and some are somewhat smaller. This is the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum in Texas, and it's actually a business. Joe Taylor will sell fossils in the United States. If you dig a fossil up, it's yours, you can sell it. He's also an artist, and he'll sell some of his art, plaster casts of fossils, so on and so forth. But it's got a strong Young Earth Creationist perspective. And when I was there a couple of years ago, I wanted to chat with him, but he was busy arguing with a couple people that I think were the owners of this Jeep that was outside with the great big American Geological Association's bumper sticker. So they were kind of involved, so I never got to talk to Mr. Taylor. They didn't seem to be agreeing on much. But you can, $35,000 for some kind of authentic dinosaur skull. He does his artwork and various casts and things like this. And where I'm going with this is, for some of these people, this creationism is only one part of what they hope to achieve out of their little facility. For him, this is a business. And it's also a little bit of self-expression, if you are going to work. Here we are. He also does, somehow or other, 6 foot by 6 foot or 8 foot by 8 foot paintings of album covers. So there's a little bit of quirkiness in some of this as well. And so it's really quite fascinating here. But more and more of these sites are coming up, marking the countryside, providing little enclaves for this community that sees itself under assault from secularism, compromise in the church, so on and so forth. So these are really becoming symbolically significant for the population. And they all help each other out. So they're totems or flags saying, we're here and we don't intend on going away. This is our part of the world. And their self-expression and so on and so forth. And since most of these are in the United States, not a little bit of good old-fashioned American roadside attraction too. Because for as much as these are theologically oriented, they're also deeply rooted in American pop culture. We'll see a few more examples. This is the ultimate, and I have to go here. These are photos that I nicked from the web. This is Creation Museum. It's in the basement of a Christian bookstore and fudge shop. You know, in small towns, you know, you have the gas station and barbershop sharing facilities. So we have bookstore, fudge shop, taxidermy hall of fame, and the antique tool museum. Now, all of this stuff in the basement was founded by a pastor who, if I understand correctly, had some kind of health issues. And so he went into semi-retirement. But he had his own collection of fossils, old tools, you know, people collect things, hobbies, and he thought, well, he'd make something of it, the space was available. And so, you know, this is self-expression as well. And so he's probably, you know, become a bit of a, maybe a bit of a local character, but very possibly a very beloved member of the community. But I do want to go there, because all of it seems to be put in together, and so you'll have a stuffed raccoon next to some reference to the Bible or something. So, this is Innisfail. This again is a business. The Dino Center, it opened up last summer. Mini golf, laser tag, and great big animatronic dinosaurs. The mini golf course has a lot of Young Earth Creationist decorations and themes explaining the young age of the Earth, fossils, so on and so forth. And so you can go drop by and visit this. The mini golf is fun. I didn't lose the game to my wife, actually. It was a tie. But you can ride on dinosaurs. There's also a Bible history museum outlining a very, very conservative view on the authenticity of the Bible's texts and so on and so forth, like that. We didn't try the laser tag, but apparently the theme there is defending a town against dinosaurs. And some of these models are actually not bad. They're, you know, well done. So this one is well known in Canada, the Big Valley Creation Science Museum. It's been there since about 2007. It's about 900 square feet on an independent building And this is the one that a lot of people think about creation museums in Alberta. And this is from the inside. So text heavy, the fossil sequence, the fossil record does not support evolutionary ascent. The fossil sequence can be explained within the context of a global flood, so on and so forth like this. I don't know if there's any real fossils in this museum. Plaster casts and fiberglass reproductions and things like that. But again, this one is fairly focused on creationism, not a lot of external stuff. But evidence from genealogy, and a reproduction of a manuscript showing the descent of the early British kings from Adam, and so forth. So this might be the oldest permanent one in Canada. Also in Alberta is the Creation Discovery Centre, operated by Larry Dye, who is a science teacher and amateur astronomer from Medicine Hat. He operated this in the Bow Island Community Church that's between Lethbridge and Medicine Hat for several years, but it's been relocating up to Brooks now. And I don't know if it's open. It's been relocating for some time. I think some things are operating in Brooks now, but I'm not too sure. Now, Larry Dye, as an astronomer, is interested in spacey stuff. So rather than dinosaurs, he has a lot of outer space and NASA-themed displays here. Trying to illustrate the young age of the Earth and so on and so forth from space. And he's also a bit of a playwright and hosts numerous plays and so on and so forth. And he does a lot of speaking around Alberta too. Whoops. What happened? So this is the Grand River Museum. Things are going completely. In South Dakota, in Lemon, South Dakota. And it's well worth a trip if you're going through South Dakota on Highway 12. Well worth stopping by. You have the cowboy on a metal dinosaur, roadside attraction. Who doesn't want to stop for a picture, right? But in it, we have not only this metal sculpture, but a number of others by John Lopez, who's an award-winning artist and related to the founder of the museum. This is Hugh Glass, the hero of the Revenant movies, that was filmed right around the Grand River, or Lemon, South Dakota. But besides being a showcase for Lopez's art, it also has Garth. Garth is a Triceratops. And the founder, Stuart Schmidt, dug Garth up out of his ranch near the Grand River. And he's found loads of dinosaur fossils on his ranch. And he got very, very tired of folks from big universities coming and stealing all of his dinosaur fossils and carting them off, putting an evolutionary stamp on it, and putting them in big cities far away from the local community. So what we have here is a fellow wanting to preserve the local heritage. His family art, but also local history. So this is the local history museum too. So although you might want to see creationists as, maybe walking away from the world with their own point of view that's very critical of the outside, Mr. Schmidt is very proud of his local heritage, the scientific heritage, And so it all comes together in a very nicely done combination museum. And he's a heck of a nice guy. He found out I was coming by, and because I emailed about opening hours, and he phoned me back in Lethbridge after I'd already left. He drove 40 miles in the morning to come meet me at his museum, just to share everything. So, you know, some people think the creationists as people who are quite afraid of the world. No. They want to live in it, but they want their own views sort of respected. So if you're going through Lemon, South Dakota, do stop. There's not many other places in Lemon, South Dakota to stop, but this is well worth your effort. Now, further south in Nebraska, in Broken Bow, Nebraska, is the Boneyard Creation Museum. And this is one of the ones that, again, very recent, but you can see this staging, not professionally done, but not poorly done. And this fellow is very, very interested in fossils. And when we arrived a year and a half ago, he just got a major truckload. We're talking a couple tons of rocks, fossil-bearing rocks. And he had a huge pile of them, and he's chipping out all these fossils and putting them on for sale and stuff like that. But you can see the dinosaurs and ducks and so on and so forth. And again, a very, very affable, friendly sort of fellow. And he did say that, do I have it? Outside his museum, he's got, if you go to the Royal Tyrrell, you can get those little wooden models of say, a T-Rex skeleton. Well, he's got a huge metal one that he took the little parts, scanned them, then blew about like 40 times. He's got this great big metal dinosaur out there. And a family was driving by, came over and rented a car, and they stopped by wondering what this is, and they said, oh, well, we'll have to go back to Poland and maybe try to build one of these. So that roadside attraction kind of thing is helping sort of spread the word. I don't want to run out of time. This is the Creation Research Museum of Ontario in the basement of Baptist Church in Goodwood, which is near Markham. I haven't been to this one. It was, I wanted to go, and it was closed for renovations and work on the building and so on and so forth. But like many of these, they will operate trips to various geological sites in the area, to sort of nature trips to interpret things according to a Young Earth perspective. This is in Winnipeg, and again, basement of a church, and John Feeks, who operates this, is a heck of a good guy. Like many of these museums, these very small ones, they don't keep regular hours. They have no staff, and it's a guided tour. They will take you through, which is basically an evangelism tour. So they will relate all of these questions they have about human evolution and stuff back to the gospel. And the Goodwood and this one probably serves little more than the local congregation. A few visitors here and there. But it does raise the question of why are they doing it? Some of these people have invested their entire retirement funds. They're never going to make their money back. They don't want to make their money back. Answers in Genesis needs to pay off $100 million. These guys, this is an investment of love and devotion. And most of my work, I'm trying to get a lot of them to have interviews and stuff and see just what it is they hope to gain, what they're getting on a spiritual and emotional level out of this kind of investment in time, money, effort. And for some of these churches, could the space not be used for other purposes. So a lot of questions have to come out of these little ones. Then there's mobile ones. This is a 45-foot semi-trailer operated in Nebraska as the Semi-Saurus. It's brand new, but it's got a creation museum inside, and they'll drag this thing around to state fairs, and so on and so forth. Alberta also has the Secrets of Creation museum run by Mr. Vance Nelson out of Red Deer. So a whole lot of reproductions of dinosaurs and stuff, and the idea was he would come to a church or a Christian school or wherever, set all this up and run a series of talks about the veracity of biblical creation, the necessity of a young earth creationist view for proper understanding of the gospel, and so on and so forth. Vance Nelson also has a number of books on fossils and on how legends of dragons are actual references to living dinosaurs and such things. And he did say, I heard him speak a year or two ago, and he did say that moving all of this stuff is a bit of a job. So often it's in storage while he goes out and speaks to churches without the props. Maybe he doesn't have a class 1, I don't know. Now, one of the things that comes up, as I mentioned already, is the price of evolution. And for many creationists, this is taken from the Answers in Genesis Museum in Kentucky. Defiance of God, putting man's thoughts ahead of divine word, of a science unencumbered by the gospel, leads to every social ill possible, including nuclear weapons, predation, starvation, racism. There is a fear here. And I'll just show you a couple little things in closing. This is Carl Sagan, who had that very popular TV show Cosmos that's being redone with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And around, I think 1980, he wrote, "The secrets of evolution are death and time. The death of enormous numbers of life forms that were imperfectly adapted, and a long time for a succession of small mutations." This is not a very promising worldview for young earth creationists. And they would argue, what is the point of a world like that? Where we are here because of an accident of random evolution. I don't want to live in a world like that. It's not that they're opposed to being monkeys, they're fundamentally opposed to having a life that means nothing. And I'll show you Ken Ham, his response to this. The battle between creation and evolution, between young earth and old earth views, is in fact a battle between two totally different histories of death. What's at place here is not whether or not their science works, but whether or not the world they see carries anything of value whatsoever. And so I think perhaps I should end there. I've got one other thing. Oh yeah, here's for the Ark encounter. They're very much opposed to children's Ark stories that whitewash Noah's Ark stories. And this is what they have. Everybody died on the Ark. So they have a display of cute Noah's Ark toys and books. And said, no, 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 no. This is what it's about. It's about judgment. And this is Noah's rain bucket from the Ark encounter. I just had to take that one. And if you want to hear Ken Ham, he'll be in Alberta along with his buddy Calvin Smith. They'll both be speaking at the Alberta Home Education Association Convention in Red Deer, April 12th and 14th. So I think I might have gone a little bit over time, but thanks for putting up with me.
we do have plenty of time, though, for comments. For
Oh, I'll keep going
discussion.
then.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts, but why don't we open it up? Because I'm sure some of you have questions, thoughts for Jim. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just curious if in any of these conversations or at any of these places, you've heard them talk about the issue of the passage in the Hebrew Bible about rabbits chewing the cud. Right? This has been an infamous passage where they say, well, the Bible says hares chew the cud. They don't in fact chew the cud. Therefore, we can't take the literal interpretation of the Bible. So that even creationists say, well, you can't use this for scientific.
Yeah, I've not found the bunny reference in the creationist stuff, but the question of literal versus figurative shows up a lot. And some of them will use the word literal, but many others, and Ken Ham and a whole host of others, are well aware that there are figures of speech and so forth in the text. And Ken Ham does say, rather than taking it literally, he takes it naturally. So poetry is poetry, Genesis is narrative, therefore it's historical narrative. So he makes that kind of gap. But there's a number of issues about biblical descriptions that don't seem to fit a narrative or seem to be wrong. And you have a whole wing of apologetics to smooth over those apparent differences. For example, the Bible talks about, at some primordial point in the past, God slaying giant sea monsters. Tiamat and Rahab, or not Tiamat, Leviathan and Rahab. That doesn't show up in Genesis. So they have to do a little bit of apologetic work there. There's, if you read the creation week story that goes from the beginning of Genesis to chapter 2, verse 4, you have humanity created on the 6th day after everything else. If you start reading into the story of the Garden of Eden, it'll say something like, before there were plants, before there were anything in the world, God created this man out of dust. Seems to be a bit of a contradiction. And it's passages like that that sometimes attracts a bit of apologetic work and sometimes just totally ignore it. It's interesting how they do that. The creation museums tend to hit again and again and again that the idea that the 6 days of creation have to be understood as 6 24-hour periods. And they will argue vociferously about that. But other points in the text where eggheads like Ian and I say, oh, there's an interpretive issue here, they just completely smooth over. Such as the first lines of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. There's all kinds of translational difficulties there. Answers in Genesis just basically doesn't want to know. So it's a combination of directed apologetics and so forth. I'll have to dig up the rabbit one. But generally, any sort of Jewish rule, they're not all that interested in. They're more interested in the 10 Commandments and gender constructs and things like that. And that they will talk about.
Thank you for an interesting talk. And in some ways you touched on it, but one of the things I always find interesting about this stuff, well, not interesting, puzzling, is of all the scientific theories they could have glommed onto, they chose the theory of evolution. So what is it about the theory of evolution that captures their imagination? Because Carl Sagan says, it's about life and death. I mean, I think he's actually, about time and death. I actually think he's wrong, but they agree with him. Right? This is what captures their imagination.
Yeah, I think what might have happened is that with Darwin, we get an overt challenge that not only attacked the Bible, but the status of humanity, and therefore the status of the gospel story. many Christians have long argued that you shouldn't take Genesis all that literally. Augustine thought the 6 days of creation was kind of metaphorical, and that God pointed all into existence all at once. Others would say, yes, we have to think of 6 days, and others would say, no. So when the geology started arguing for an older and older Earth, that wasn't that major. Evolution comes along and says, suddenly, we are not in the image of God, we are in the image of apes. It says, God did not breathe breath of life into our nostrils, we're monkeys. So that really ticked it off. Plus, Darwin had a long and I think quite well-known argument with the captain of the Beagle. So Darwin went along to give the captain of the Beagle someone educated to talk to, because you can't talk to the rank and file sailors, and to do some naturalist work. Darwin was dead set against slavery, Captain Fitzgerald was not, and they just didn't see eye to eye. They spent 5 years on this stupid little boat just liking each other. And so when Darwin finally published his ideas, there was all of this sort of backlash. And he did challenge the church directly. So I think a lot of it comes from that. So evolution becomes the tag word for cosmology, all sorts of other things. When creationists talk about evolution, they don't just mean the biological theory of evolution. They mean the Big Bang, the whole bed. So they collapse it all into that one nasty word. Yes, sir?
Their attempt to look like natural history museums seems to be incredibly focused on dinosaurs. Is there any kind of engagement with other aspects of paleontology?
There is, but the kids like the dinosaurs. You will find, often it would depend on what is being dug up in the local area, but bison and so on and so forth. But just like a lot of our natural history museums are kind of dinosaur rich. So are they. But you will find also numerous casts of hominid skulls and so on and so forth. And there we have a big discussion about what is fully human, fully in the image of God, and what is an ape with a birth defect, or something like that. Or what is a hoax. The Piltdown Man hoax is still current in creationist circles. It's just how easy it is to trick a scientist. The Big Creation Museum in Kentucky has a wonderfully done display on Lucy. I forget how old Lucy's supposed to be, a couple million years, something like that. But this hominid that's supposed to be in the Australopithecus, I think, that's supposed to be in human line. And they're arguing that this is not a human or anything related to human, that is pure ape. And this huge display with all kinds of nice computer-generated holograms and stuff like this, trying to illustrate how flexible science can be in the interpretation of these fossils, and they don't have the full skeleton. And so using the same skeleton, they dress up Lucy as a chimpanzee, as a gorilla, as an orangutan, things like that, and saying, look at how subjective this is. And one of the things that does come out, and it's, I think Answers in Genesis started this, but it's a common trope now, that the secular paleontologist and the creationist paleontologist all start with the same data. What differs is their starting point, their philosophical starting points. So this is a fundamental in their understanding of paleontology. That's not exactly accurate because the creationists use the Bible as data, not just an intellectual starting point. But it's one of the ways they do address that. But yeah, mostly dinosaurs. Kids love dinosaurs. There was, in fact, Creation Ministries International once complained about the presence of dinosaurs in the secular natural history museums, saying that dinosaurs were, what do they put it, the gateway drug to evolution, and hence atheism. Right, so they're turning that on its head. There's a lot of creativity on this. It's really fun. But somebody had a yes.
How do they understand Genesis 2? Just as another creation story, or what?
In Genesis 2, we begin the Garden of Eden story. And it will vary. Some would see it as a direct continuation from the creation week. So the sixth day, God rested seventh. This is, so it just backs up a little bit. And they'll solve the problem of plants and animals showing up after by playing with the Hebrew a little bit. Others would see it as just kind of it's starting again, it's a different story, but it's completely compatible. So they will take one of two routes, but that is standard in Christian theology. But they do have to play with the Hebrew to make the two different apparent sequences work. And people who understand from the secular point of view how Hebrew works would say, no. It's not, here we had God made the animals and brought them to Adam, not God had made them. So, but we don't want to talk about Hebrew verbs. I forgot most of them. Yes, sir.
The fact that many of these museums are private gives them a certain level of autonomy, and therefore they can resist influence from the evolutionary science side. What about the other direction? What are some examples that you encountered where the Young Earth Creation Science folks try to influence either public museum construction and mapping, or even private ones too? They
tend not to get very far. They tend to go after schools. But there has been cases where you get, I think the Royal Tyrrell has faced some opposition from the Young Earth Creationist movements, but they don't, they get a very diplomatic letter in response, and then they carry on doing what they're doing. What you do get are groups that would publish guidebooks to secular museums, and other organizations that will do tours, creationist tours of secular museums. But the main focus is public schools. And there, depending on the state, they will have greater or lesser success. Many of the law cases over the past many decades in the United States have been directed towards this with differing strategies of creationists. At first, we have just the outright banning on evolution because it was considered offensive. This got overturned in the 60s when the US was trying to recover from the shock that the Russians could actually put something in space, and boy, do we need to up our science game. But from there were moves to have creationism understood as scientifically valid. And the US courts consistently argue that no, this is religious. At least the Supreme Court and so forth. State legislatures and courts might be a bit different. But the new move now is something called equal time, where you get a group arguing that since evolution and atheism and agnosticism and humanism are all religious points of view, they have no more right to a presence in a public school than we do. But rather than knock things over and have a tantrum about it. So I told you I don't have a budget for a typewriter. And that was actually in my script to do that. So rather than just sort of say evolution shouldn't be there, because they know they'll never get that, they'll argue, how about giving us equal time? Or, let the teacher decide, things like that. And that has won the day in some state legislatures, in Louisiana, places like that, mostly in the southern part, but not exclusively. So that tends to be the game that's played. But with the US Supreme Court, even intelligent design that doesn't get theological and seems to be designed to avoid theology and hence the appearance of religion and hence offending the US Constitution that says the government shouldn't affirm or reject any religious point of view. That has been seen by federal courts as a creationist point of view, and therefore for a government or a school to affirm this is unconstitutional. There was a famous trial in Dover, Pennsylvania in 2005 about this. And a judge who was appointed by George Bush ruled that the intelligent design is inherently religious and has no place in a science classroom. So that was seen as a big victory for the secularists and a big setback for especially the ID camp, but also Young Earth Creationists.
Any other questions? We have time for maybe one more question. Thought for Jim? This is probably too big of an issue to get into, and I know that your research is mainly focused on the North American context, but it's fascinating to me that these are popping up in Europe as well. And I really appreciated how you showed how complex the navigation is, right? They're navigating biblical interpretive issues, they're navigating scientific interpretive issues, and how those two things might come together. But then they're also bringing in local interests, local concerns, right? The guy in South Dakota who not only who has a local war, exhibits about local war heroes and so on incorporated in his museum. But so we often think about these things because of cases like that as thoroughly American or thoroughly North American, because to be frank, we have them here too, right? A thoroughly North American kind of phenomenon, but they're popping up in Europe too. Do you know how are the museums or how are the folks in Europe that are presenting this material, how are they navigating their own local political issues and concepts?
There's been some interesting court cases in Great Britain where it was ruled a few years ago, I think, in Scotland that creationism has no place in a public school in Scotland. This offended some. But we have a much smaller community in Europe, and especially in England. There's a few small places. But a lot of their products, a lot of their tools are coming from the United States, and up in Canada too. And so it's interesting, and one of the things that I want to look at is the impact of the American stuff outside of an American context, because it's so overwhelming. Han is Australian. He moved to America. A lot of the other ones are also Australian, coming up to America, and so they're seeing things through the lens of American constitutional arguments and lawsuits and things like that. And I'm interested in how that might impact up in Canada, where we don't have this separation of church and state kind of thing. We got a different set of formulations. And I'm just sort of beginning to get a handle on that. But you get a couple in Great Britain. There's one little one, I think, somewhere in Germany, and then there's a Bible museum in Germany that also has a creationist exhibit. One in Portugal. There's only one or two little ones in Australia, oddly enough, because that seems to be another hotbed. And there's a resort in Hong Kong modeled after the Noah's Ark. And hopefully, if you all pay your taxes, I'll get a grant and I'll go and see it and come back and show you pictures.
Excellent.
Yeah, I didn't think that would work.
Well, let's thank Dr. Linville again.